By this time next year, during the summer of 2014, an email will be sent to space. And on that email, the instructions, the blueprints for a robot on the International Space Station to begin building the first parts ever manufactured off planet Earth. Today, I want to tell you how this incredible story has come to be and what it means not just for space exploration, but really for life as we know it. Now, to start, it's first important to talk about one of the problems that the space industry has always faced and why it is so incredibly hard to make progress in space. Recall back to 1990. The Voyager 1 space probe had just finished its initial mission, and it was headed towards the outskirts of our solar system. At the request of Carl Sagan, NASA sent a command to the spacecraft to turn its cameras around and take an image of planet Earth. At over 6 billion kilometers away from our home planet, Earth showed up as just a tiny little speck. And in Carl Sagan's famous pale blue dot speech, he said, "Look at this speck. Everything we know, everything we have ever known has happened here on this little speck, on this mote of dust suspended on a sunbeam." And this really captured within us this sense of vulnerability, how alone we are in this vast cosmos. It made us realize the problems that we're facing with the space industry. Because today, 23 years after this image was taken, 44 years after Neil and Buzz first stepped foot on the moon, here we still are, trapped on the surface of the planet. Now, it's been joked that the dinosaurs went extinct because they didn't have a space program. Well, we do. And perhaps we just haven't made best use of it just yet. Now, it's my belief that humanity is destined to become a multi-planetary species, that one day we will live on other planets, we will build worlds of our own, and when we do so, we will solve the problems that we face here on Earth today. Because when we go to live in space, we have to become 100% self-sufficient. We have to grow our own food and recycle our own waste, clean our own water, collect our own energy. We have to do all that in a completely renewable fashion. So these are the technologies we need here on Earth today. Undoubtedly, abundant energy and clean water are things that would benefit everybody on Earth. Now, that's not to say that we haven't always wanted to colonize space. Of course we have. It's just that the means to do so haven't existed. My message today is that it is no longer the case. But what it gets down to is that there's a problem with the space industry, and that problem is the supply chain. Everything that we have ever put in space has had to start here on the surface of the planet, at the very bottom of what we call Earth's gravitational well. We start by building giant rockets that have to travel across oceans on ships. They have to go on trains to the launch pad. And by the time we finally launch these rockets, it takes an enormous amount of energy just to get that tiny little payload at the top into space. The Apollo astronauts had to travel 10 times the speed of a rifle bullet just to get to the moon. Think about that. In fact, anything we have ever sent into space has had to travel that fast, 10 times the speed of a rifle bullet. To put a cost perspective on it, 1 liter of water in space today costs $10,000. In fact, that cost price hasn't changed over the course of time very much because it's all dependent on the physical limits of chemical propulsion, the backbone of every rocket today. Now, if the purpose of a supply chain is to move goods from point A to point B, there are really only 2 conceivable ways to improve a supply chain. The first is that you move the goods faster from point A to point B, and the second is that you decrease the distance the goods have to travel. Now, since the dawn of the space age, we have been trying endlessly to move goods faster to space, to be more efficient about it. But we've done very little on part of decreasing the distance the goods have to travel. And at first thought, it makes sense. It doesn't seem like we can decrease the distance that goods have to travel to get to space. However, in 2010, I co-founded a company to do just that, to decrease the distance that goods have to travel in order to get to space. And if our idea works, it will completely disrupt the space supply chain. The company is called Made in Space, and our dream is space manufacturing, to in fact build what we need in space there, in space. And the way we plan to do this shouldn't surprise you, because it's a technology that already today is disrupting the supply chains here on Earth. Often called the third industrial revolution, it's 3D printing. And 3D printing is disruptive to the supply chain Because what it does is essentially moves point A directly to point B. We build the things we need directly where we need it. So in 2010, people weren't really recognizing the disruption 3D printing might have on a supply chain, let alone how it could affect space exploration. So anticipating this, Made in Space laid out 3 fundamental steps to bring 3D printing to space as quickly as possible. The first, take the current 3D printing technology into zero gravity. Understand what it takes to make it work. The second, adapt the technology so that it could go to space. And the third, fly this technology to the International Space Station. And we chose the International Space Station for 2 main reasons. The first, this is the only place that we have humans living in space today. If we could give them the ability to manufacture what they need there, we could reduce their dependency on Earth and make their lives better. And the second is to remove the barriers of entry so that anybody with a good idea for space can have access to space, to open space for everyone. So we started trying to test these printers in microgravity. And there are really only a few ways to do this aside from going to space. And the best way, really, is to take an airplane through a set of acrobatic maneuvers in the sky where it goes up and down, up and down. Every time you go up, you're weightless for about 20 seconds, and every time you go down, you're about twice your weight. So over the summer of 2011, we flew 3 flight weeks with NASA. Each flight week had 4 flights, and each flight about 40 of these parabolas. So if you do the math, that's quite a bit of time in zero gravity. And I must say, zero gravity is one of the best experiences of my life. You very quickly adapt to this environment. It's almost as if we were made to live in this new dimension. One of my favorite things to do is to flip upside down and put my feet on the ceiling of the airplane and recognize that in zero gravity, there really is no such thing as down. Whichever way your feet are facing feels like down to you. And when you look down the airplane, everybody else looks like they're upside down. So we took dozens of these 3D printers on these flights. We took commercial 3D printers as well as printers that we build ourselves, all in hopes that we would find some very basic modifications to make that we could take a commercial printer and put it in the space station as quickly as possible. We very quickly learned that we were very far off from that goal. Every single 3D printer we tested had problems, and it became very clear that removing gravity from the equation had detrimental effects. So we started to look at what it would take to modify a printer. And the real problem is actually, makes a lot of sense when you think about it, but the solutions weren't so easy. You see, every single 3D printer today has been designed inherently with gravity in mind. Gravity is there to hold the build platform in place to make sure the belts and the pulleys move appropriately. And when you're in zero gravity, things begin to float. And even if they float within a fraction of a millimeter, that can throw off an entire print, because each print lays down one layer at a time within fractions of a millimeter. And on top of that, the thermal characteristics were different. We all know that in this room, hot air rises. But in zero gravity, when there is no up and there is no down, the hot air tends to just coalesce around the point where it's created. So we had to come up with very clever ways to keep the hot parts of the printer hot and the cold parts cold. But by the end of the summer, we had accumulated over 2 hours of total zero gravity manufacturing time. This was far more manufacturing in zero gravity than anybody had ever done. And we quickly became the world expert in 3D printing in zero gravity. So the next step was to design a printer for the space station. And whether we realized it or not, we had chosen to put a printer in one of the most extreme environments human beings have ever created. Even if one of these commercial printers would have worked in zero gravity, it wouldn't have met all the requirements for NASA to fly to space. So we had to design a 3D printer from the ground up for space. It had to be very easy for the astronauts to use, extremely reliable and maintenance-free, and more than anything, very, very safe. So that's what we set off to do. And the printer, once it's on the space station, will be used to reduce Earth dependency for the astronauts. Today, the way we do this is by sending a lot of spare parts. There are entire modules on the space station filled with these white cargo transfer bags packed to the brim with spare parts. Most of the parts will never get used, but they're there just in case they're needed. So imagine, for an instance, when the 3D printer is on the space station, we can remove all these spare parts, have a few bags of feedstock, and build the parts as we need them, turning the stowage space into usable space. We'll start building tools and spare parts and hardware for the crew. Today, when a tool is needed that's not there, the crew has to improvise. Last year, astronaut Sunita Williams had to fix a critical power system on a spacewalk using her toothbrush and some duct tape. Fortunately, the tool worked, but you could imagine a scenario where a 3D printer would have had to save the day. And that gets to emergency scenarios. One of the most famous probably emergency scenarios in space was Apollo 13. We almost lost the crew. Now, we all remember the famous saying that they sent back to Houston, "Houston, we've had a problem." We like to think that if a 3D printer were with them, maybe they would message back, "Houston, we have a solution." And we specifically looked at the square filter that they had to adapt to fit into a round hole to keep themselves alive. One engineer at May in Space spent an hour on this, designing an adapter, and by the end of the day, we had it printed and functional in our lab, just to prove how quickly a 3D printer can solve a mission-critical situation. Now, the space station is a research laboratory. Today, it's used to do stem cell research, cancer research, long-duration spaceflight research. Very important stuff. However, unlike any research lab on the ground, it has a problem. It's hard to iterate research quickly. On the ground, a researcher builds an experiment, runs it, looks at the results, iterates, fixes the experiment, and keeps going until a breakthrough is made. In space, the researcher is not there with the experiment, and it's a really hard process to get a new part up to fix that experiment. So once the printer is there, researchers will actually be able to fix their experiments on the fly, leading to breakthroughs in space much faster. We will also begin building satellites in space. And this is really exciting because today there are these small satellites, 10 centimeters on a side, called CubeSats. CubeSats are packed with the latest electronic technology of the day. They're used for Earth observation, communications, a whole host of science experiments. The problem, though, is that they're so small, it's hard to launch them. They have to wait for a much larger satellite to be launched so that they can piggyback on the side of it. By next year, we'll be able to 3D print satellites in space, taking the time from months, maybe years, to get your satellite into space down to weeks, even days. So here we are now. We're building the first 3D printer for the ISS. We've taken it through a gambit of tests with NASA. We put it in vibration to simulate the loads it will see during launch. We've taken it into an acoustic chamber to measure that it doesn't emit anything harmful to the crew. And the most fun part, we've taken it back into zero gravity. We've proven that our design for a zero gravity 3D printer actually does work. Definitely one of the highlights of the job. And this all gets down to this one date, August 1st, 2014, when we strap our printer onto a SpaceX rocket and launch it into space. And the moment that that printer is unpacked from the space station and put into use, for the first time ever, humanity will have the ability to literally email hardware to space. Think about that. In the beginning, the government space agencies will use it to reduce what they need to send. They'll build it there. They'll try out new scenarios for missions to Mars and to the moon. And countries that have never been able to afford space exploration will now be able to afford it. Countries around the world will become spacefaring nations along with the rest of us. And if there are countries that can't afford space exploration, then surely individuals and small organizations can as well. We tend to fix that. We tend to open the doors for everyone so that there is a renaissance in space, that new ideas can flourish, and the progress that we've always wanted in space can finally happen. And this gets around that fundamental problem with the supply chain to space, launch. Today, everything we build has to survive the 8-minute treacherous journey into space where it sees G-loads that it would never experience in the weightless environment. We have to design everything to fit inside of that diameter of a launch fairing. So imagine when we actually build in space, we have the opportunity for new space mission architecture. We'll have the ability to build new types of structures. Structures that wouldn't even survive their own weight here in this room, but would be perfectly suited for the zero-gravity environment. And we'll use computers to optimize these structures so that they can move the really hot 250-degree Fahrenheit temperatures from the sun across the structure to where it's negative 250 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. We'll make perfect structures for space. And then one day, we'll actually mine the moon and we'll mine asteroids to get their resources. And at that point, we won't just have new structures to build with, but new materials, new building blocks to make our structures with. Imagine taking a nickel-iron-rich asteroid and using that iron alloy to manufacture with. We don't build space structures with iron alloys today because it's too heavy to launch. But one day, perhaps, in space, that will be the material of choice. And all of this one day will benefit Earth. We'll have the ability to build giant solar collectors above Earth to capture the sun's energy before it's degraded through our atmosphere. And we'll beam that energy wirelessly to anywhere on Earth so that anybody has access to an abundant source of energy. The developing world will come out of darkness. That's all great, but here we are today. Voyager 1 made history this year. It is now the first man-made probe to leave our solar system. And once again, we're reminded of just how vulnerable we are, how alone we are in this cosmic ocean. Mother Nature gives us these reminders as well. We saw meteors crashing over Russia this year, reminding us that we are constantly at threat and that we have to do something about it. But all this will change next year. A very disruptive event will happen for the space industry. And from there on out, we will be emailing hardware to space. And the age of space manufacturing will have begun.